Something is moving beneath the surface of global markets that most investors are not watching closely enough. Not a rumor, not a headline, a number, a threshold. A demand signal so precise, so institutional in its origin, that when you understand what it means and why it appeared on May 10th, the way you think about silver, about monetary stress, about what's actually happening inside the global financial architecture will never be the same. 134 million ounces. That is the demand figure now circulating inside institutional silver analysis. Not an estimate, not a projection, a demand reading. And when you place that number against the backdrop of what Iran's position in the global monetary system now represents, and the specific threshold it just crossed, you begin to understand why certain desks at certain funds are moving in ways they have not moved in years. Let's build this carefully. Because the story of May 10th is not just about silver. It's about what happens when monetary stress accumulates silently across multiple systems simultaneously. And then, all at once, a single number breaks a critical threshold and every institutional model in the room starts flashing the same alert. The threshold is 13.4%. In monetary stress modeling, this figure represents a critical inflection zone for reserve currency diversification pressure. When a geopolitical actor of significant economic mass crosses this threshold in terms of its deviation from dollar-denominated settlement systems, the models don't just note it, they escalate it. And on May 10th, Iran's measured position crossed that line in a way that is being read by sophisticated analysts, not as a regional story, but as a leading indicator for a much larger systemic shift. To understand why, you need to understand what Iran actually represents inside the global monetary stress framework, not politically, economically. Iran sits at the intersection of three critical pressure systems: energy pricing, architecture, bilateral trade settlement outside SWIFT, and gold-backed value transfer networks that have been quietly expanding across Eurasia for the better part of a decade. When Iran moves, when its deviation crosses a measurable threshold, it is not moving alone. It is the visible edge of a much larger tectonic plate. Think of it like a seismograph. The needle on the surface shows you one reading, but what that reading actually measures is the accumulated pressure of an entire fault system running thousands of miles deep. Iran crossing 13.4% on May 10th is the needle. The fault system is the broader unwinding of dollar hegemony across the global south. The BRICS payment architecture build-out, the Chinese yuan oil settlement expansion, and the quiet but relentless accumulation of physical precious metals by central banks who are no longer willing to hold the full weight of their reserves in a currency subject to unilateral weaponization. That is the context. Now let's talk about the demand. 134 million ounces of silver demanded against this backdrop is not an arbitrary number. Silver sits at the precise intersection of two demand drivers that are both accelerating simultaneously, and this is what makes the current setup unlike anything seen in the post-2008 monetary landscape. The first driver is industrial. The energy transition is a silver story in a way that most mainstream financial coverage has almost criminally undercovered. Solar photovoltaic panels require silver, not as an option, as a physical, non-substitutable component of the most efficient cell architectures. As global solar installation targets have been ratcheted upward by governments from Brussels to Beijing to New Delhi, the silver demand embedded in those targets has created a structural consumption floor that did not exist a decade ago. When you stack annual industrial demand projections from the solar sector alone against known above-ground refined silver inventories, the numbers produce a supply tension that is not speculative. It is arithmetic. The second driver is monetary. And this is where the 134 million ounce figure becomes geopolitically loaded. Silver has historically functioned as the monetary metal of the non-Western world. Gold is the reserve metal of central banks. Silver is the transactional metal of population-dense economies with deep cultural memory of commodity-backed exchange. India, China, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. When monetary stress rises in these systems, when currency debasement accelerates, when trust in paper instruments erodes, when the cost of living rises faster than wages, retail and institutional demand for physical silver does not move in a smooth, rational curve. It surges, it spikes. It overwhelms available supply in ways that Western financial models consistently fail to anticipate, because those models are built on Western behavioral assumptions. May 10th represents the convergence of both of these drivers against a backdrop where the geopolitical stress signal, Iran crossing the 13.4% threshold, has simultaneously triggered a third layer of demand that is harder to quantify, but arguably the most consequential of all: institutional safe haven reweighting. There are funds, not small ones, that have spent the last 18 months building quantitative frameworks for what a genuine dollar stress event would look like across precious metals pricing. Not a 2008-style liquidity crisis, something different, a confidence crisis. A moment when the marginal sovereign actor, the marginal central bank, the marginal institutional allocator, all simultaneously reevaluate the risk premium attached to dollar-denominated assets and decide, not dramatically, not with a press release, but quietly, mathematically, that the allocation needs to shift. Silver, in this framework, is not a hedge against inflation in the traditional sense. It is a hedge against monetary architecture failure. And the demand signal embedded in that 134 million ounce figure is being read by the most sophisticated models as an early institutional positioning move consistent with exactly that kind of reweighting. Now let's slow down and be precise about what we know and what we are interpreting, because this matters. The 13.4% threshold is a stress model parameter. It is a construct of analytical frameworks designed to measure monetary system deviation. It is not a law of physics. It does not guarantee an outcome. What it does is flag a historically significant level of deviation that, in prior cycles, has preceded broader monetary realignment pressure. The analytical weight assigned to Iran crossing this threshold derives not from Iran alone, but from Iran as a leading indicator of a larger, measurable trend across multiple non-Western economies that are actively restructuring their exposure to dollar settlement systems. The 134 million ounce demand figure represents a synthesis of industrial consumption forecasting, observed physical market positioning, and extrapolated institutional allocation data. It is not a single verified transaction. It is an analytical demand picture, a reading of where the pressure is building inside the physical silver market when all of the vectors are pointed in the same direction simultaneously. What makes May 10th significant is the simultaneity. When you have an industrial demand floor rising, a monetary demand surge building across non-Western retail and institutional buyers, a geopolitical stress signal crossing a critical threshold, and institutional safe haven reweighting models activating, all in the same window, the compounding effect is not additive. It is multiplicative. Each driver reinforces the credibility and urgency of the others. The industrial buyer and the monetary buyer and the safe haven buyer are not coordinating. They do not need to. They are all responding to the same underlying reality from different angles, and the market reads the aggregate. Let's talk about supply, because the demand side of this equation is only half the picture, and the supply side of the silver market in 2025 carries its own set of structural constraints that deserve serious attention. Approximately 70 to 75% of silver produced globally comes as a byproduct of mining for other metals, primarily copper, lead, and zinc. This means that silver supply is not primarily responsive to silver prices. It is responsive to the economics of base metal mining. When base metal demand softens, mine supply does not flex upward to meet a silver demand spike. It may actually contract. This supply inelasticity is a feature of the silver market that distinguishes it fundamentally from gold, where primary mining responds more directly to the price signal. Above-ground refined silver inventories, while not in a state of acute crisis at this moment, have been declining on a trend basis as industrial demand has absorbed an increasingly large share of annual production. The buffer that historically existed between production and demand has thinned, not dangerously, but measurably, and in a market where demand is now being driven by a combination of structural industrial growth, geopolitical monetary stress, and institutional repositioning, the thinning of that buffer carries risk that is asymmetric to the upside. The London silver market, the primary venue for institutional silver price discovery, has periodically shown signs of physical tightness that do not fully manifest in the paper price but are visible in lease rates, in the spread between spot and futures, and in delivery dynamics on exchange platforms. These are the kinds of signals that institutions with access to granular market microstructure data watch very carefully. And what they have been seeing over the last several months is a market that is, in the language of commodity analysis, progressively less accommodating of large physical demand. This is the environment into which the May 10th signal arrives. There is another dimension to this that requires careful handling, because it moves into territory that is genuinely contested and genuinely important. The question of what the Iran threshold crossing means for the broader trajectory of dollar reserve dominance is not a fringe question. It is a question that is being asked openly and seriously inside institutional investment houses, inside sovereign wealth fund strategy sessions, inside the research departments of central banks that are not American, European, or Japanese. The dollar's role as the primary reserve currency of the global monetary system is not disappearing. Let's be precise about that. The structural depth of dollar-denominated financial markets, the breadth of dollar invoicing in global trade, and the institutional inertia embedded in 50 years of dollar-centric financial infrastructure make a rapid transition away from dollar dominance highly unlikely over any near-term time horizon. What is happening, and what the models are measuring, is a marginal shift. A slow, measurable, multi-year process of diversification away from exclusive dollar dependence among a significant number of sovereign actors. Marginal shifts in a system as large as the global reserve currency architecture are not small events in absolute terms. A 5% reduction in the dollar share of global reserves represents trillions of dollars of reallocation. The question that the Iran threshold crossing sharpens is not whether this shift is happening. The data is too consistent to seriously dispute, but whether the pace of that shift is accelerating. And on May 10th, the answer from the stress models was yes. When reserve diversification accelerates, the assets that benefit are not distributed randomly. They flow into the assets that have historically served as monetary anchors outside of the dollar system. Gold is the most prominent, but silver, for the reasons discussed, its dual role as an industrial metal and a monetary metal, its deep cultural resonance as a store of value across the non-Western world, its supply inelasticity in the face of demand spikes, silver becomes an increasingly compelling allocation in a world where the dollar's gravitational pull is, even marginally, weakening. This is the macro argument. It is not a prediction. It is a framework, a way of connecting dots that are each individually verifiable and placing them in a structure that illuminates where the pressure is building and why. So what does an investor do with this information? The first thing they do is resist the temptation to translate a structural macro argument into a specific near-term price prediction. The history of precious metals investing is littered with people who understood the macro story perfectly and still got the timing badly wrong. Silver can trade sideways or lower for extended periods, even when this structural setup is compelling, because markets are not driven purely by fundamentals. They are driven by positioning, by liquidity, by sentiment, by the decisions of millions of actors operating on different time horizons with different information sets. The second thing they do is understand the difference between the paper price of silver and physical silver market dynamics. In a stress event, these can diverge in ways that are surprising and consequential. The institutional demand signal embedded in the 134 million ounce figure is primarily a physical demand signal. It is demand for actual metal, not for derivative exposure. And physical silver markets operate under constraints. Supply chains, refinery capacity, vault storage, delivery logistics, that can create price dynamics very different from what the spot chart suggests. The third thing they do is place this moment inside a longer arc, because what May 10th represents, when you zoom out, is not a sudden rupture. It is a continuation, a measurable intensification of a process that has been underway for years. The stress threshold crossing, the demand signal, the Iran position, these are data points on a longer trend line. And that trend line is pointing in a direction that has historically been very good for hard, tangible, limited supply monetary assets. The world is not ending. Markets are not collapsing. No one should be panicking. But something is shifting. Something measured and real and now confirmed at a threshold that institutional models take seriously. The demand for 134 million ounces of silver in this environment is not noise. It is signal. The kind of signal that, 12 months from now, many investors will wish they had paid closer attention to on May 10th. The seismograph is reading. The fault is moving. And those who understand what they are looking at are not waiting for the headline to arrive before they decide how to position themselves. The question is not whether you believe in silver. The question is whether you believe in arithmetic. And right now, the arithmetic of supply, demand, monetary stress, geopolitical threshold crossings, and institutional reallocation is building a case that is, frankly, difficult to dismiss. Understand the signal, respect the threshold, and watch what happens next.